Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that every struggle in your life, every physical ailment, every moment of confusion and pain stems from a single horrifying truth, one that isn't even your fault. You realize that your trembling hands, your difficulty breathing, your clouded thoughts all trace back to decisions made before you were even born. Your parents, driven by an obsession with keeping bloodlines pure, have condemned you to a life of suffering. You discover that your mother is your cousin, your father is your uncle, your grandmother is also your great-aunt. The family tree doesn't branch. It's a twisted vine, choking itself in its own coils. You are not the product of love, but of a calculated breeding program designed to preserve power and wealth, with no regard for the human cost. This isn't fiction. This was reality for countless women throughout history, trapped in a web of genetic destiny that they never chose. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand these women's stories, we must first understand the twisted logic that created their suffering. For centuries, European royalty believed that marrying within their own bloodlines would preserve their divine right to rule. They saw their blue blood as literally different from that of commoners, purer, more sacred, blessed by God himself. The practice was so common that by the 16th century, European royal families were essentially one massive interconnected web of cousins, marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and siblings producing children who would rule empires. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that they were creating a genetic nightmare that would echo through generations. The Habsburg family of Austria and Spain perfected this art of self-destruction. Their family motto might as well have been "Let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry." But their marriages weren't happy. They were calculated genetic disasters that produced some of history's most tragic figures. Our first story takes us to Vienna, 1634. In the shadowed corridors of the Hofburg Palace, a child is born who will never know a day without pain. Maria Anna of Austria enters the world with the Habsburg curse already written in her genes, the result of generations of cousins marrying cousins, of a family tree so tangled it resembles a noose. From her earliest memories, Maria Anna knows she is different. While other children run and play, she struggles to walk. Her spine curves unnaturally, forcing her into a hunched posture that makes breathing difficult. Her jaw protrudes so severely that she can barely eat solid food. Servants must cut her meat into tiny pieces, and even then meals become exhausting ordeals of careful chewing and cautious swallowing. But Maria Anna's physical struggles pale beside the psychological torment of understanding why she suffers. She grows up surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, and in each painted face, she sees echoes of her own deformities. Here, an uncle with the same protruding jaw. There, a grandmother with the same curved spine. She realizes, with the terrible clarity that only comes with suffering, that she is not unique. She is the latest victim in a long line of genetic catastrophe. The palace physicians, with their bloodletting and their prayers, can offer no relief. They whisper among themselves about the Habsburg curse, but never in her presence. To her face they speak of mysterious ailments and God's will, never admitting the truth that everyone knows but no one dares speak, that her suffering is the direct result of her parents' and grandparents' obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. Maria Anna spends her days in dim rooms, curtains drawn to hide her from the world, and the world from her. She learns to read voraciously, her sharp mind one of the few parts of her body that functions properly. In books, she finds worlds where bloodlines don't matter, where people marry for love instead of lineage, where children aren't born carrying the sins of their ancestors in their very bones. But reality always intrudes. Court physicians examine her regularly, documenting her deformities with clinical detachment. They measure the curve of her spine, the protrusion of her jaw, the weakness in her limbs. She becomes not a person but a case study, a living example of what happens when genetics go wrong. The loneliness is perhaps worse than the pain. Potential suitors, all of them also her cousins, recoil when they see her. Marriage negotiations begin and end quickly once her condition becomes known. She remains unwed, not by choice but by circumstance. Even in a world where cousin marriage is normal, her deformities are too severe to overlook. Maria Anna dies young, at 32, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of genetic damage. Her death certificate lists various ailments, but the real cause is never written down. She died because generations of her ancestors chose power over humanity, purity over compassion. From Austria, our story moves to Spain, to perhaps the most tragic figure in this dark tapestry, Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs who expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain and funded Columbus's voyages, Joanna seemed destined for greatness. Instead, she became a cautionary tale about the price of keeping bloodlines pure. Joanna's madness wasn't apparent in childhood. She was intelligent, educated, fluent in multiple languages, but the seeds of her destruction were already planted in her genes. Her parents were cousins, part of the same interconnected web of European royalty that had been marrying within itself for generations. The first signs appeared after her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. The union was arranged to strengthen political alliances, but it became a psychological battleground. Philip was unfaithful, cold, manipulative. Joanna's response was intense, obsessive love that others interpreted as madness. But was it really madness? Or was it the natural response of a woman trapped in an impossible situation? Joanna had been raised to believe that marriage was her highest calling, that producing heirs was her sacred duty. When that marriage became a source of constant humiliation and pain, her mind fractured under the pressure. The real tragedy began when Philip died suddenly in 1506. Joanna's grief transformed into something darker, more obsessive. She refused to allow his burial, traveling across Spain with his coffin, opening it regularly to kiss his decomposing corpse. The image is horrifying, but it speaks to a deeper truth about her condition. She had been so isolated, so deprived of genuine human connection, that even death couldn't break her attachment to the one person who had shown her attention, however cruel. Her father Ferdinand and later her son Charles V used her supposed madness as justification to lock her away. For 46 years, Joanna lived in confinement in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The conditions were deplorable. She was kept in dark, cold rooms, given minimal food, denied basic hygiene. Her attendants reported that she would go weeks without washing, that she would tear her clothes to shreds, that she would scream for hours at a time. But here's the crucial question. Was Joanna really mad, or was she driven to madness by her circumstances? Modern historians increasingly believe that her madness was largely political, a convenient excuse to remove a legitimate queen from power. Her behavior, while extreme, can be understood as the natural response of someone suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, exacerbated by decades of isolation and abuse. The genetic component cannot be ignored. Joanna's family tree shows clear patterns of mental illness, depression, and anxiety, conditions that become more common and more severe with inbreeding. Her great-grandmother had similar episodes. Her daughter Catherine would later show signs of severe depression. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Joanna died in 1555, still imprisoned, still officially mad. Her death was barely noted. She had been erased from public memory decades earlier, written off as an inconvenient madwoman rather than acknowledged as a victim of a system that valued political convenience over human welfare. Our next story unfolds in the golden halls of the Spanish court, where a little girl named Margaret Theresa carries the weight of empire in her frail body. Born in 1651, she is the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Mariana of Austria. Yes, his niece, because by this time the Habsburg family had become so inbred that uncles routinely married their brothers' daughters, and no one saw anything unusual about it. Margaret Theresa's childhood is documented in exquisite detail through the paintings of Diego Velázquez, court painter to the Spanish kings. In these masterpieces we see a child who should be playing with dolls but is instead dressed in elaborate court gowns, her small face already showing the telltale signs of Habsburg genetic damage. Look closely at Velázquez's portraits, and you'll see what the artist was too diplomatic to emphasize, but too honest to hide completely. Margaret Theresa's jaw protrudes slightly, just enough to hint at the severe deformities that would become more pronounced with age. Her eyes have a distant, almost vacant quality that speaks to developmental delays. Her posture, even as a child, suggests the spinal problems that plagued her family. But the most tragic aspect of Margaret Theresa's story isn't her physical condition, it's her complete lack of agency over her own life. From birth, every decision about her future is made by men who see her not as a person, but as a political tool. She is promised in marriage to her uncle Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, when she is still a toddler. The engagement is celebrated across Europe as a diplomatic triumph, with no one stopping to consider what it means for the child at its center. Margaret Theresa grows up knowing that her only purpose is to marry her uncle, and produce heirs to continue the Habsburg line. She receives the finest education available to women of her time. She learns to speak several languages, to play musical instruments, to dance and paint. But all of these accomplishments are viewed merely as ways to make her a more attractive bride to her uncle husband. The marriage takes place in 1666, when Margaret Theresa is just 15 years old. Leopold is 26, old enough to be her father, and is literally her father's brother. The wedding is celebrated with elaborate ceremonies and public festivities, but for Margaret Theresa, it represents the end of whatever childhood she had left. The physical reality of her marriage is something that court records hint at, but never explicitly describe. Margaret Theresa is expected to produce children immediately, despite her young age and frail health. The pressure is immense. The continuation of the Habsburg dynasty depends on her ability to give birth to healthy heirs. She does become pregnant multiple times, but the results are tragic. Her first child, a daughter, lives only a few months. Her second pregnancy ends in miscarriage. When she finally gives birth to a son who survives infancy, the relief at court is palpable, until it becomes clear that the child has inherited the full spectrum of Habsburg genetic problems. Margaret Theresa herself grows weaker with each pregnancy. The combination of inbreeding-related health problems and the physical strain of constant childbearing takes a severe toll on her body. She suffers from what modern doctors would recognize as severe anemia, respiratory problems, and possibly epilepsy. Court physicians document her decline with clinical precision. They note her increasing difficulty with speech, her frequent seizures, her inability to keep food down. But they never connect these symptoms to the obvious cause, the genetic damage caused by generations of inbreeding. Margaret Theresa dies in 1673, just 6 years after her marriage, at the age of 21. Official records list the cause of death as fever, but the reality is that her body simply gave up under the accumulated weight of genetic defects and physical trauma. Her death is mourned throughout the empire, but not for the right reasons. Courtiers and diplomats lament the loss of a potential source of heirs, not the tragedy of a young woman whose life was sacrificed to preserve a bloodline that was already poisoned beyond redemption. Our journey now takes us to the glittering court of Versailles, where behind the elaborate ceremonies and magnificent architecture, a Spanish princess named Anna of Austria struggles with the hidden costs of her Habsburg heritage. Born in 1601, she is the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, yet another uncle-niece pairing that was considered not just normal but desirable among European royalty. Anna's early life in Madrid follows the familiar pattern of royal inbreeding consequences. She develops slowly as a child, showing the characteristic learning difficulties that plagued many Habsburg descendants. Her jaw protrudes noticeably, making speech difficult and eating laborious. But perhaps most tragically, she exhibits signs of what modern medicine would recognize as severe anxiety and depression, conditions that make her daily life a constant struggle. In 1615, at age 14, Anna is married to Louis XIII of France as part of a complex diplomatic arrangement. The marriage is meant to cement peace between Spain and France, two powers that had been at war for decades. What no one considers is the psychological impact on Anna herself. She is torn from everything familiar and thrust into a foreign court where she is expected to immediately adapt to new customs, a new language, and a new role as queen. The French court initially welcomes her with elaborate celebrations, but the reality of her situation quickly becomes apparent. Louis XIII is a cold, distant husband who shows little interest in his young wife. He is dealing with his own psychological issues. Modern historians believe he suffered from severe depression and possible homosexuality in an era when such feelings could not be acknowledged, let alone acted upon. Anna finds herself trapped between two impossible expectations. As Queen of France, she is expected to produce male heirs to secure the succession. But as a Habsburg, she carries genetic defects that make healthy childbearing extremely difficult. Her first several pregnancies end in miscarriage or infant death, each loss adding to her depression and anxiety. The court physicians, following the medical understanding of their time, blame Anna for these failures. They subject her to increasingly painful and humiliating treatments, bloodletting, purging, bizarre dietary restrictions. They examine her intimate areas regularly, looking for signs of what they call defects in her feminine nature. No one considers that the problem might lie in the genetic inheritance she received from generations of cousin marriages. Anna's isolation deepens as years pass without a surviving heir. She becomes the target of court gossip and political intrigue. Nobles whisper that she is cursed, that God disapproves of the Spanish marriage, that France needs a new queen. The pressure becomes so intense that Anna begins to show signs of what modern medicine would recognize as severe agoraphobia. She becomes afraid to appear in public, spending days at a time hidden in her private apartments. Her relationship with Louis XIII deteriorates further as both partners blame each other for their childlessness. They begin living essentially separate lives, coming together only when court protocol demands it. Anna turns to religion for comfort, spending hours in prayer and developing an almost obsessive devotion to Catholic ritual. The miracle, when it finally comes, seems almost too good to be true. After 23 years of marriage, Anna gives birth to a healthy son, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. The birth is celebrated throughout France as a sign of divine favor, but for Anna, it represents both triumph and renewed terror. She knows that her primary value lies in her ability to produce heirs, and now she faces the pressure to repeat this success. A second son, Philippe, is born 2 years later, securing the succession and finally giving Anna some relief from the constant pressure. But the physical and emotional toll of her years of suffering cannot be undone. Anna remains a deeply anxious, depressed woman who finds little joy even in her eventual success as a mother. Her later years are marked by increasing physical problems, digestive issues, respiratory difficulties, and what court doctors describe as melancholy attacks that leave her bedridden for days at a time. Modern analysis of her symptoms suggests she suffered from the anxiety disorders and depression that ran in Habsburg bloodlines, conditions exacerbated by the trauma of her early marriage experiences. Anna dies in 1666, having outlived her husband and seen her son established as one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. But her legacy is not the political success that history books celebrate. It's the human cost of a system that treated women as breeding stock and ignored the genetic consequences of dynastic marriages. While Marie Antoinette is remembered primarily for her role in the French Revolution, her story is also deeply connected to the Habsburg tradition of inbreeding and its consequences. Born in 1755, she was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, a marriage that, while not as closely related as some Habsburg unions, still carried the genetic legacy of centuries of cousin marriages. Marie Antoinette arrived in France in 1770 as a 14-year-old bride, carrying with her not just the hopes of the Austrian-French alliance, but also the hidden burden of Habsburg genetic inheritance. Her famous portraits by artists like Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun show a beautiful woman, but they also reveal subtle signs of the family traits: the slightly protruding lower lip, the distinctive Habsburg jawline that had become more pronounced with each generation of inbreeding. But Marie Antoinette's real struggles weren't immediately visible. Like many Habsburg descendants, she suffered from what court physicians described as feminine difficulties, severe menstrual problems, frequent miscarriages, and what modern medicine would recognize as hormonal imbalances, likely caused by genetic factors. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI was troubled from the beginning, but not in the way that gossips assumed. Both young people were dealing with their own genetic inheritances. Louis XVI showed signs of developmental delays and social awkwardness that made intimacy difficult, while Marie Antoinette struggled with the anxiety and depression that had plagued Habsburg women for generations. The pressure to produce an heir was immense. For 7 years, the marriage remained unconsummated, leading to vicious rumors about both partners. Court physicians examined Marie Antoinette regularly, looking for physical reasons for the couple's failure to conceive. What they didn't understand was that both partners were dealing with psychological and possibly physical issues stemming from their inbred heritage. When Marie Antoinette finally did become pregnant, her difficulties continued. Her first pregnancy was marked by severe morning sickness, anxiety attacks, and what modern doctors would recognize as prenatal depression. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse was born healthy, but subsequent pregnancies were marked by miscarriages and infant deaths that took a severe psychological toll. The most tragic aspect of Marie Antoinette's story is how her genetic inheritance intersected with the political catastrophe of the French Revolution. Her anxiety and depression, possibly exacerbated by inbreeding-related hormonal issues, made it difficult for her to navigate the complex political situation developing around her. Her tendency toward impulsive decisions and emotional outbursts, traits that might have been manageable in a stable political environment, became fatal flaws as France descended into revolution. Court observers noted her increasing erratic behavior as the political situation worsened. She would swing between periods of manic activity and deep depression, unable to maintain the consistent political judgment that the crisis demanded. Modern historians debate whether these mood swings were purely circumstantial or whether they reflected underlying psychiatric conditions common in Habsburg bloodlines. The famous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she probably never actually said, reflects the way her enemies used what might have been symptoms of genetic mental health issues to paint her as callous and out of touch. Her real tragedy wasn't callousness, but rather the opposite. She was overwhelmed by the suffering around her and lacked the psychological tools to cope effectively. During her imprisonment and trial, Marie Antoinette showed remarkable courage, but also signs of the dissociative episodes that had affected other Habsburg women under extreme stress. Guards noted her periods of apparent confusion, her difficulty focusing on questions during interrogation, and her tendency to retreat into herself when faced with overwhelming pressure. Her execution in 1793 ended not just a life, but a genetic line that had shaped European history for centuries. In her final moments, she reportedly showed the dignity that had always been her best trait, but also the resignation of someone who had never fully understood why her life had been so difficult. To truly understand the scope of Habsburg genetic tragedy, we must examine not just individual women, but entire generations destroyed by the practice of inbreeding. The Spanish infantas of the late 17th and early 18th centuries represent perhaps the most concentrated example of genetic catastrophe in European royal history. These were the daughters and granddaughters of Charles II of Spain, himself so inbred that his genetic coefficient, a measure of how closely related his parents were, was higher than that of children born to brother-sister pairs. Charles II was impotent, epileptic, and possibly intellectually disabled, the end result of 16 generations of Habsburg inbreeding. But Charles II's sisters and female cousins, the infantas, suffered perhaps even more than he did because they were expected to marry and produce children. Their stories read like medical case studies in the consequences of genetic isolation. Maria Margherita, born in 1651, exhibited severe developmental delays from early childhood. Court records describe a child who couldn't speak clearly until age 7, who had difficulty walking, and who showed signs of what modern medicine would recognize as autism spectrum disorders. Yet she was still considered marriageable because of her royal blood. Her sister Maria Theresa showed different but equally tragic symptoms. She suffered from what court physicians called falling sickness, almost certainly epilepsy, and had such severe respiratory problems that she could barely climb stairs. Her jaw was so malformed that she could eat only liquid foods, and her spine was curved to such a degree that she needed support to sit upright. These women grew up in the Alcazar of Madrid, a palace that had become more hospital than royal residence. Teams of physicians, surgeons, and priests attended to various royal children, all suffering from different manifestations of the same underlying genetic catastrophe. The palace records from this period read like a medical textbook on the consequences of inbreeding, epilepsy, developmental delays, physical deformities, immune system failures, and psychiatric disorders. Yet even in their suffering, these women were expected to fulfill their primary royal function, producing heirs. Marriage negotiations continued despite their obvious unfitness for childbearing. European courts received detailed medical reports on their conditions, not out of concern for their welfare but to assess their potential value as breeding stock. Maria Margherita was eventually married to her cousin Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, the same man who had previously been married to Margaret Theresa. The marriage was a disaster from the beginning. Maria Margherita's developmental delays made it impossible for her to understand her marital duties, while her physical problems made consummation extremely difficult. The psychological torture of these arrangements cannot be overstated. These women grew up knowing that their only value lay in their ability to produce children, yet their genetic inheritance made healthy childbearing nearly impossible. They lived with the constant fear of pregnancy, knowing that each conception risked not only their own lives but would likely produce children even more damaged than themselves. Court records from this period reveal the human cost in heartbreaking detail. Letters between royal women describe miscarriages, infant deaths, and the constant fear that accompanied each pregnancy. They write of children born so deformed that they couldn't survive outside the womb, of babies who lived only days or weeks before succumbing to genetic defects. The psychological impact was devastating. Many of these women developed what modern psychiatry would recognize as severe anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress. They became reclusive, afraid to appear in public, ashamed of their appearance and their failures as wives and mothers. Perhaps most tragically, they often blamed themselves for their inability to produce healthy heirs. The genetic science that would explain their condition wouldn't be developed for centuries, so they interpreted their struggles as personal failures or divine punishment. This self-blame added another layer of suffering to lives already overwhelmed by physical and emotional pain. To fully understand these women's stories, we must examine the genetic science that explains their suffering. When closely related individuals reproduce, their children have a higher chance of inheriting 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. In a healthy, genetically diverse population, these harmful genes are usually masked by normal copies inherited from unrelated parents. But when cousins marry cousins generation after generation, as the Habsburgs did for centuries, harmful genes accumulate and compound. Each generation becomes more likely to express genetic disorders that would normally remain hidden. This process, called inbreeding depression, affects not just physical traits but also mental health, immune function and fertility. The Habsburg jaw, technically called mandibular prognathism, is one of the most visible examples of this genetic accumulation. This trait became more pronounced with each generation of inbreeding, eventually becoming so severe that some Habsburg descendants couldn't properly close their mouths or chew solid food. But the visible deformities were just the tip of the iceberg. Modern genetic analysis suggests that Habsburg descendants also suffered from increased rates of epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, anxiety disorders, depression, and immune system deficiencies. Many of the mysterious illnesses that plagued royal women were likely autoimmune disorders caused by genetic damage. The fertility problems that affected so many Habsburg women can also be explained by genetics. Inbreeding increases the likelihood of genetic incompatibilities that make conception difficult and pregnancy dangerous. The high rates of miscarriage and infant mortality in Habsburg bloodlines weren't due to medical ignorance alone, they were the inevitable result of genetic damage accumulating over generations. Perhaps most tragically, the psychological problems that affected women like Joanna of Castile and Marie Antoinette can be understood as genetic predispositions to mental illness being triggered by environmental stress. These women weren't inherently mad, they were genetically vulnerable to anxiety and depression, conditions that were then exacerbated by the impossible pressures of their royal positions. What makes these stories even more tragic is how the system perpetuated itself despite obvious evidence of its harmful effects. Royal courts had extensive records documenting the health problems that plagued inbred bloodlines, yet they continued arranging cousin marriages for political advantage. Court physicians wrote detailed reports on the physical and mental health problems affecting royal children, yet these reports were treated as medical curiosities rather than warnings about genetic damage. The connection between inbreeding and health problems was obvious to anyone willing to see it, but political and economic considerations always took precedence over human welfare. The Catholic Church, which could have intervened by refusing to sanction such closely related marriages, instead provided dispensations that made even the most genetically dangerous unions legally and religiously acceptable. The Church's position was that royal bloodlines were divinely ordained, and that preserving their purity was more important than preventing human suffering. Even the affected women themselves sometimes perpetuated the system. Having been raised to believe that their royal blood made them superior to commoners, some actively sought marriages with their own relatives to preserve what they saw as their genetic inheritance. They didn't understand that they were participating in their own genetic destruction. The most heartbreaking aspect of this perpetuation is how each generation of women hoped that their children would be different, that somehow their offspring would escape the genetic curse that had plagued their families for centuries. They endured pregnancy after pregnancy, miscarriage after miscarriage, hoping against hope that the next child would be healthy. The Habsburg genetic experiment finally came to an end with Charles II of Spain, whose death in 1700 without heirs sparked the War of Spanish Succession. Charles II was so genetically damaged that he was impotent and possibly intellectually disabled, the final tragic endpoint of centuries of inbreeding. His death marked not just the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, but the beginning of a slow recognition that royal inbreeding was unsustainable. While cousin marriages continued among European royalty, they became less common and less closely related, as courts began to understand the genetic risks involved. The women whose stories we've explored were victims of a system that valued political convenience over human welfare, genetic purity over genetic health. They suffered and died not because of personal failings or divine displeasure, but because their ancestors made choices that prioritized short-term political advantage over long-term genetic consequences. Their legacy is not just the historical record of their suffering, but the scientific understanding that grew from studying their condition. Modern genetics owes much to the tragic Habsburg experiment in inbreeding. Their pain contributed to our understanding of how genes work and why genetic diversity is essential for human health. While royal inbreeding on this scale is largely a thing of the past, the forces that created these tragedies still exist in different forms. Isolated communities around the world still practice cousin marriage, often with similar genetic consequences. The fundamental tension between preserving cultural traditions and protecting genetic health continues to play out in various contexts. More broadly, these stories remind us of the dangers of treating people as means to an end, rather than as individuals deserving of dignity and choice. The Habsburg women were reduced to their reproductive function, valued only for their ability to produce male heirs and preserve bloodlines. Their individual needs, desires, and welfare were secondary to political considerations. This dehumanization isn't unique to royal courts of the past. Throughout history and continuing today, women have been reduced to their reproductive capacity, their worth measured by their ability to produce children for the benefit of others. The Habsburg tragedy is an extreme example of a pattern that continues in various forms worldwide. As we reach the end of these tragic stories, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The suffering of these women served a purpose, though not the one their tormentors intended. Their pain, documented in court records and medical texts, provided crucial evidence for the development of modern genetics. The Habsburg genetic experiment, horrific as it was for those who lived through it, gave science invaluable data about the consequences of inbreeding. Modern understanding of recessive genes, genetic diversity, and hereditary disease patterns developed partly from studying the tragic outcomes of royal cousin marriages. This doesn't justify their suffering or diminish the horror of their experiences, but it does mean that their pain wasn't entirely meaningless. The knowledge gained from studying their condition has helped prevent similar tragedies and has contributed to our understanding of human genetics. The women we've discussed, Maria Anna of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Theresa of Spain, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the forgotten Spanish infantas, were real people who lived real lives, filled with real suffering. They weren't just historical footnotes or genetic case studies. They were daughters, wives, mothers, and human beings who deserved better than the fate that genetics and politics conspired to give them. Their stories serve as a reminder of the importance of putting human welfare above political expediency, of recognizing the individual dignity of every person regardless of their social status, and of understanding that even the most powerful institutions can perpetuate tremendous suffering when they lose sight of basic human values. Return with me now to that moment of terrible realization we imagined at the beginning, waking up to discover that your entire life has been shaped by decisions made before your birth, by ancestors who valued bloodline purity over human welfare. For the women whose stories we've explored, this wasn't imagination but daily reality. They lived with the knowledge that their physical pain, their mental anguish, their reproductive failures, and their social isolation all stemmed from the same source, a genetic inheritance poisoned by generations of inbreeding. They carried not just their own suffering, but the accumulated weight of centuries of poor decisions made by people who should have known better. Yet in their pain we find something profound about human resilience. Despite their circumstances, many of these women found ways to assert their humanity. Maria Anna became a scholar, finding intellectual freedom in a body that imprisoned her. Joanna maintained her fierce love even in madness. Margaret Theresa bore her suffering with dignity. Anna found solace in faith. Marie Antoinette faced death with courage. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to assert its worth. They also remind us of our responsibility to learn from their suffering, to ensure that our pursuit of political, economic, or social goals never again requires the systematic destruction of human beings. The curse of keeping bloodlines pure has finally ended, at least in its most extreme forms, but the memory of these women and their suffering lives on, a testament to the price of valuing ideology over humanity, tradition over compassion, and power over love. In the end, their legacy is both tragic and redemptive. Tragic because their suffering was preventable, redemptive because their stories have helped ensure that such systematic genetic destruction will never again be pursued in the name of royal purity. They paid the ultimate price so that we could learn a lesson their ancestors refused to see, that human worth cannot be measured by bloodline, and that true nobility lies not in genetic purity, but in the courage to acknowledge our common humanity. Their voices, silenced by death and time, still echo through history with a simple, profound message. Remember us not for our royal titles or our political significance, but as human beings who deserved better than the fate that genetics and politics conspired to give us. Remember us and learn from our suffering, so that others might be spared the curse of keeping bloodlines pure.